All right. Joining me now is someone who I've been wanting to talk to for a while now. You've probably seen her tweets about immigration and as well as her efforts to get a translator to US soil. Kristy Perano. Kristy, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been talking about this story, you and I think in Twitter DMs, and I just wanted to, if you want to just give like a overview we're going to detail about what it is that you've been trying to do the last few years.
Yeah, sure. So I got involved in this issue of trying to assist U.S. military interpreters in late 2016, early 2017 timeframe. So there are several nonprofits that work in this space. The one I had been in contact with in late 2016 is called No One Left Behind, and they still do have a national presence. There have been some other offshoots of them, and the New York chapter later became Keeping Our Promise. But anyway, in late 2016, Hillary Clinton was widely expected to win election, and I had contacted them to see if I could volunteer for anything, and I was a couple hours away from the closest chapter, and they kind of thought they had the policy thing under control because the presumed Clinton administration would presumably be reasonably favorable to immigration for U.S. military interpreters. So they kind of like, well, thanks, but no thanks. And then obviously Hillary Clinton was not elected, so the incoming Trump administration was much less favorable to immigration in general, especially immigration of Muslims, than the Clinton administration, a Hillary Clinton administration probably would have been. So in early 2017, when President Trump had announced that he was going to do the first of his travel bans or Muslim bans, depending on which party you come from, there was just widespread panic amongst the interpreter community about whether this was going to affect SAVs. And then I started trying to at that point I did start volunteering with No One Left Behind and trying to respond to this influx of interpreters that were worried about what was going on. And I have been, through the last few years, I've been trying to assist several interpreters with their cases, and one individual in particular that I've put a lot of effort into his case. And then I've also ended up going to DC and trying to work on the policy issue, which I think we'll talk more about policy soon. So for the one translator, Mohammed, that I've been most involved with, I got in touch with him in early 2017 because he was part of this group that had contacted No One Left Behind that I was trying to help respond to. And in his case, he had worked for the U.S. mission for 10 years in Afghanistan, about 7 years for the U.S. military, and then about 3 years for the UN. And then he had already fled Afghanistan and went into hiding in Pakistan 3 years earlier because of repeated assassination attempts by the Taliban. And because of policy at the time, and because of not having all the documents he needed to do a special immigrant visa application, which is the more traditional route, he had applied as a refugee. And the UN had approved his case and sent it to the US, which then denied it for discretionary security concerns, which can be anything, including that their name is misspelled. It does not necessarily mean that there is any sort of valid security concern with someone. It's basically a catch-all category that lets USCIS deny a case and avoid any scrutiny for their denial. So this has become an increasing problem, starting with the Obama administration, but greatly increased during the Trump administration, was denying interpreters for discretionary, or really any refugees for discretionary reasons, so that they could avoid them having any legal recourse to get the case reviewed. So he was in a pretty unique situation that he was applying as a refugee instead of a more traditional special immigrant visa, and the case had already been denied for these discretionary concerns. So no nonprofit really wanted to deal with a denied case because it's just a lot of work and less likelihood of success. So my family and I started by trying to help him reconnect with veterans, which we succeeded in finding. One that had privately told me he was supporting, but because of his position, he wasn't able to publicly support. And then we found one that was publicly supporting the case. And I also started trying to find a nonprofit to assist him, but it turned out the nonprofits didn't want denied cases, and the veterans were like, well, you're doing a great job, don't let me stop you. So we ended up realizing that this guy was in a terrible situation and no one else was going to do anything to help. So for the last 4 years, we became more and more involved in trying to advocate for this family. And we started in 2017 by filing an emergency humanitarian visa, which is called humanitarian parole. And they do process them pretty quickly. And in this case, they processed them in 2 days, but they denied the cases and admitted they didn't bother reading them. So I think the humanitarian parole was probably collateral damage in President Trump's immigration orders, because I think there was language in there that said that we don't like humanitarian parole because it's kind of a loophole. Basically, if someone is going to use humanitarian parole, like an emergency humanitarian visa, to come to the US and then go on to apply for asylum, President Trump didn't like that. So the president does not have the authority in most cases to unilaterally suspend implementation of a law, but he was effectively able to do that just by including language in his executive orders that this is not a good thing for people to do. And then USCIS just, I believe, started basically denying all of these humanitarian parole for future asylum seekers type applications, including this one for Mohammed family. In our case, we had a lawyer who had some contacts at USCIS, and we also had some congressional support. So we did push back on that. First, our lawyer contacted USCIS and said, well, why did you deny the case? And they said, well, because he was denied before as a refugee. They said, well, why did you deny his refugee case? They said, oh, we'd have to actually read it to figure that out. So they basically admitted that they hadn't read the case yet. So,
that's insane.
Yeah, and then she tried to get, so this interpreter has a brother and a sister in the US. His sister was actually willing to take his kids. And at the time he had 4 daughters who were between the ages of 2 and about 9. So then she pushed back and said, well, you could at least save the kids. And they said, oh yeah, that seems like something maybe we could work with you on. And then a few weeks later, they came back, the Humanitarian Affairs Branch Director, whose name was John Bird, said, well, actually the information relating to the denial of the refugee case concerns the principal, his wife, and the daughters. So therefore, this denial is final. So he effectively made the legal claim that giving a 1-year visa to a 2-year-old child was a security concern to the United States, because the purported reason that the refugee case was denied was security reasons. And he said the information relating to the denial of the refugee case also concerns the daughters, the youngest of which was 2. So no one in Congress was going to try to defend blacklisting toddlers. So, but we talked to our lawyer, and she's like, well, yeah, it's stupid, but it's not illegal because there's no law in the US that puts a age, cap on how old you have to be to get blacklisted by USCIS. So we ended up going to Congress several times and saying, look, we've got this family, this father who served the US faithfully for 10 years, who was on missions collecting classified intelligence on the Taliban, who was trusted by special forces as a top level interpreter. And now USCIS has this undisclosed security concern that they're not willing to tell anybody about, but it's effectively a death sentence. So we did get a lot of support in Congress. We got a letter in mid 2007, or I think, sorry, in 2018. So in 2017, we applied for humanitarian parole, and then there was a few months of back and forth. And then finally we went to DC and was like, hey guys, USCIS is blacklisting toddlers. What are you gonna do about this? And we got 38 House members, I think it was 28 Democrats and 10 Republicans, to send a letter saying we're concerned about this and we'd like to review this case. And we'd also like data on how many other interpreters have been denied under these nebulous discretionary security concerns. USCIS dragged their feet for a few months. They were supposed to respond in a month. They took 4 months to write back. When they first got the letter, they asked for a privacy release from Mohammed, which we got him to sign, and we supplied them, and they acknowledged receiving. 4 months later, they wrote back and said, well, we can't tell you why we denied the case because we would need written permission from Mohammed. They didn't even mention that privacy release forms exist, so they pretended that they don't exist. There was no legal way for them to get a waiver that they actually already had, and pretended they didn't have. And then they supplied some information on, they said they refused to answer the question on denied Afghan interpreters, and they supplied some data on Iraqis, which showed that there was a 99.7% drop in admission of Iraqi interpreters between 2015 and 2018. And the denial rates had gone from 10 10 to 15% under the Obama administration of discretionary denials, up to 92% under the Trump administration. So, and Congress hasn't bothered to ask for data since. So, but as of 2018, the Trump administration was blacklisting 92% of Iraqi US military interpreters as being a discretionary security concern. And these would have been people that had previously been vetted by the US military, and in most cases had not had an issue with the US military. So we're not talking about like a group of terminated interpreters. We're talking about interpreters that had worked for the US military in Iraq and in most cases would not have been terminated or had any issues with the military. So then we've continued for the last couple of years, like making more trips to DC, trying to get Congress to follow up on their letters. They sent a couple more letters. Eventually USCIS reopened the case and conducted a hostile re-interview of Mohammed, and then they closed the case again and told Congress to get lost, and then coronavirus happened, and then Congress never followed up on it. They eventually, then when coronavirus hit, USCIS had to start being nice because they needed money from Congress. So then they dug up this old thing and said, oh, well, yeah, here, Congress, we'll be happy to talk to you about this case. But then they said that, well, but we can't have a secure briefing because we can't meet in person. So we'll just talk about it on the phone in a non-secure setting. So they set up a phone call where USCIS just said, trust us, we wouldn't make a mistake. And Congress said, oh, okay. And that was about it. And then they also told Congress that they did not deny the kids individually, which they did do. So I don't know if those staffers were intentionally lying or just didn't review the case, but they made misleading claims to Congress, told Congress, don't worry about it. We wouldn't have denied anybody's case without good cause, didn't answer Congress's questions about when specifically their concerns arose. And then Congress kind of got busy with elections and forgot about it. We're trying, my family and I are planning to go back to DC in the next few weeks and see if we can get some more efforts in Congress to work with the new administration. And then we've also been we've written a case for Canada to do like a group of 5 sponsorship, because Canada oftentimes accepts refugees that previously had trouble getting into the US. And we currently have a couple of people who are looking for more people to do a group of 5 sponsorships that we're kind of pursuing. We are continuing to pursue trying to get to the bottom of what's happening in the US. And then we've additionally started working on trying to get the family to Canada, and just whichever succeeds first, because they're in a very critical situation in Pakistan. So any either US or Canada or any country that would be willing to get them out of their current situation would be our goal at this point.
I think that everyone who's listening to this should rewind and give that entire thing a second and a third listen, because I was just listening to that and some of the things I heard, it's crazy that the asylum system, particularly for translators, particularly for people who helped the US Armed Forces in a time of conflict, it strikes me that it could possibly be that difficult for them to get to safety. I remember watching a segment by John Oliver from a few years ago, basically showing like how the inner workings of the translator system works, and how this is back when Obama was president, and just how difficult it is for a translator to get to US soil. And he was ultimately, jokingly said that a donkey in Iraq had an easier time getting onto a US base than Iraqi translators have had getting to US soil. Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess my question is like, what is it? How is it about the policies of the Biden and Trump and Obama administrations compare with each other? Just because it seems like the indefensible nature of the asylum system for translators has been apparent for a while.
Yeah, it's a little early to know like exactly how the Biden administration is going to fall. So, I mean, as I kind of touched on, there were a lot of issues with the Obama administration. We have this called special immigrant visa system, and at the beginning there were like hardly any visas, and then there have been a couple of times that they started, I think, I don't know, around 2012 or so, they started authorizing more visas, and they started getting like processing more visas, but they had a legal requirement to do it in 9 months, and it's always taken like 2 to 3 years most of the time. And there's just absolutely no enforcement that they have to do it in 9 months. So the whole, ever since the very beginning of the Afghan war, I don't remember exactly what year they started like trying to bring in significant numbers, but basically for the last 10 years, they've been trying to process more of these visas. But the whole time there have been significant backlogs, and oftentimes there's quite a bit of ability for them to just deny a case without really explaining why, which in some cases there may be valid reasons, but in many cases there's not, and there's not really a process to review it. So the Obama administration, going back to the Obama administration, the SIV process has always been a long and difficult process. Sometimes the requirements change. So the State Department can update their requirements for HR letters every year, which means that if you got an HR letter a couple years ago and that defense company is now defunct, then the translator has to go back and try to get fresh letters to meet this year's requirements. So that's another real issue. I think there hasn't, the special immigrant visa between the Obama and the Trump administration probably didn't change as much as maybe news stories would have led you to believe. Like basically during the Obama administration, conservative outlets tended to talk about translators having issues getting here. And then during the Trump administration, liberal outlets like to talk about it. If you actually look at the State Department data on arrivals of special immigrant visas, it fluctuated a little bit during the Trump administration, but it wasn't probably that much different than the Obama administration. Anecdotally, the Biden administration is getting visas processed faster, because I know like some cases I've been involved with personally that have been like stuck for 2 years that just a couple days ago got approval. So it does seem like things are moving more, but it hasn't been long enough to like have State Department data released on that, like for the Afghan special immigrant visas. Then what ended up happening with Iraqis was they started out with the special immigrant visa, but then in 2014, the special immigrant visa program was allowed to expire for Iraqis. So that would have been during the Obama administration. No one really bothered to renew the special immigrant visa program, but then they had subsequently started what they call the direct access program, which basically let an Iraqi apply, who was either an interpreter or a family member of an interpreter, apply to the US as a refugee without having to first flee the country and register with the UN and go through that process. And that used to let in several thousand a year. And then that between 2015 and 2018, those numbers crashed to like a few dozen a year. So that just declined catastrophically under the Trump administration. And under that program, the denial rates were 10 to 15% on these nebulous security concerns under Obama, and then they went up to 92% under Trump. So I think, like I said, the special immigrant visa problem has always, special immigrant visas have always taken longer than they're supposed to. But the data for Obama versus Trump, I believe the Trump administration was a little worse, but not dramatically worse than Obama for special immigrant visas. But the direct access program for Iraqis was a whole nother story, where it was kind of functional under Obama, and it just 99.7% shut down under Trump. And that is part of the refugee cap. So the fact that President Biden has increased the refugee cap and said he wants more refugees, I would anticipate that we would start seeing Obama level like immigration of Iraqi refugees with US military connections fairly soon. But it does take a couple of year vetting process normally for the US to accept a refugee. So it's, again, you're probably not going to see, like, it's going to take more than a month or two to start seeing the results of that. But I would expect that Biden would at least revert to more Obama era policies on refugees. Whether the Biden administration actually streamlines these cases more than Obama and cuts down on denials without, apparent good justification remains to be seen, because it's really too early to know whether the Biden administration just sort of going to revert to Obama policies and say, well, good enough, we're better than Trump, or whether they're really serious about trying to improve on what Obama's policies were.
Right, and you mentioned like one of the policies that Biden is about to enact in this month, which is raising the cap on refugee resettlement, which could, I think you mentioned, could potentially ease the path for refugees to get stateside. Is that a fair characterization? Or
Yeah, I think it will, just because the process at least takes a few months. I think there are many refugees that are in the final stages. I think there's like 20 or 30,000 that are at or near the final stages, so those might start coming soon. Then yeah, since it will be increased to 62,000, and they may not actually meet that in this calendar year, but then they plan to do 120,000, I think, the next calendar year. So I do anticipate that in the next few months, the refugee resettlement will really ramp up to more consistent with historic levels instead of the really low levels under the Trump administration.
right. I do want to ask, though, about another potential policy shift coming in the next few months that could potentially affect the path for refugees and translators, particularly in Afghanistan. And that is the decision of the Biden administration to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And I mean, maybe this is just my uneducated opinion, but I do anticipate that possibly causing problems for refugees, including for translators. Like, for example, now the people who have to make the trip to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul now have to traverse unprotected through Taliban-controlled territory, and are translators now going to be persecuted by the Taliban without U.S. troops present? Is this a possibility that could hinder the efforts of translators in Afghanistan to get to U.S. soil?
Yes, I really think so. This issue is deeply concerning to everybody in the community that's advocating for Afghan interpreters, because the Taliban already controls a lot of territory in Afghanistan. And with U.S. withdrawal, if the Afghan government doesn't completely collapse, it's going to at least lose a lot more territory to the Taliban, which is going to make the Taliban a lot more free to try to kill people on their hit list, which includes every U.S. military interpreter. I mean, if they have information that someone worked for the U.S. military, doesn't matter how short the time, like they want those people dead. So, and I don't think, I mean, the Taliban signed this nominal peace deal, but I think the Taliban version of peace is once we kill everyone we don't like, then things will be peaceful. I don't think the U.S. didn't even try to get the Taliban to agree, much less implement a policy of not retaliating on Afghans who aided the U.S. So a lot of these areas, there is a lot of Taliban activity. I think a lot of U.S. military interpreters are already in Kabul and other like safer, more urban areas. But there's a lot of stories of targeted killings even in urban areas. Like I mean, I've heard, I don't know, a couple months ago, some Afghan interpreter who was living in Kabul and just like got shot right outside his house. And so somehow the Taliban got intelligence on, here's where this guy's living, and they got him assassinated. So yeah, that's very concerning, and there's not much time left. And there's about probably between 12 and 17,000 principal applicants, it's estimated, that like worked with the U.S. military or have some sort of pending SIV case. And there's also some that don't have, that are like family members of interpreters or interpreters that have lost too much documentation to do an SIV case but haven't yet fled the country. So it is, I think, a pending humanitarian disaster to pull out of Afghanistan without actually having a plan for how to maintain stability in that country. And what concerns me is that no administration that has talked about this has really had a discussion of how do we finish processing this multi-year backlog of special immigrant visas before we pull out of the country. So it tends to be a political decision that we should have more troops or less troops, but there's not a lot of discussion of like, well, if we are supposed to be legally obligated to finish processing SIVs in 9 months, maybe we should finish processing these visas that we were supposed to have finished processing years ago before we pull out of this country and potentially let the government collapse and the Taliban have free reign to assassinate everyone they don't agree with. So yeah, that is an issue that is deeply concerning. And I do believe the Biden administration is doing a little better job processing SIVs than the Trump administration, but I don't think is not really theoretically possible that they could get through the whole list of visas they're supposed to process before they, at least now, are saying they would have completed the withdrawal. So yeah, I'm very concerned about what's happening with that policy.
I hope someone at the Defense Department who has Joe Biden's ear ends up watching this video. I really do. I think that, as you laid out, this could be one of the biggest mistakes that Joe Biden ends up making of his presidency. Because you laid it all out, that there are real concerns about what could happen to translators if the Taliban, particularly if the Taliban gets control of the country. That's the big
Yeah.
worry that I have. But what more, needs to be done in terms of policy, in terms to get translators stateside? And is there anything else, coming up that we should, keep an eye on that could be relevant to this?
So I think it's kind of hasn't been done in a long time, but one of the discussions that advocacy groups are pushing for is for the US to do something similar in Afghanistan to what they did in Iraq in 1996, and that is to airlift out those Iraqi or Afghan nationals that had aided the US and bring them to a third location for processing. Like in 1996, it was Guam. They airlifted out about 6,000 Iraqi Kurds. They knew that Saddam Hussein was just going to come in and kill them, so they airlifted them to Guam, and then I think ultimately ended up resettling most of them as refugees in the US. But while they were in the process of processing their visas and verifying their identities, they allowed them to live in US territory. So that obviously hasn't been done in a long time, but that's, I think, the number one option that advocacy groups are pushing for Afghans is to, and it could be tricky to figure out like exactly who qualifies to participate in the airlift, but basically trying to go in and take people that have some sort of documentation that they work for the US military as an interpreter or would otherwise be SAV eligible, and like airlift them or somehow arrange their transportation to a safe third location where the visas could be processed. I was on a call with a lot of other advocates on Thursdays, and they were like kind of optimistic that they were going to be able to apply enough pressure to the White House to get this done. I don't have any, like, I think they've been in discussion with the White House and like had people they think are sympathetic to the idea, but I don't think there's been any commitment either way. They haven't said no, but they also haven't said, yeah, we're working on this. So, so there's some hope for that. And I think the other thing that can happen is sometimes there's behind the scenes military activity that is not official. And even like a year and a half ago or so, I was told by congressional staffers of like members on Armed Services Committee that were probably knowledgeable about the situation that a lot of the troops in Afghanistan are not officially in Afghanistan. So it's like the US officially has 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, but they might unofficially have a lot more that are on various clandestine missions. So I don't know that the Biden administration has much in the way of plans to like keep troops there, but the Biden administration could be trying to have their cake and eat it too politically, where they make a big deal out of withdrawing troops and then they redeploy some of those same troops on secret missions to avoid having Afghanistan collapse and avoid all of the negative press that would come from abandoning Afghanistan and having the government totally implode and a huge humanitarian disaster. So no one really knows, like, I mean, I think we should take them at face value that they are planning a withdrawal. I don't doubt that they're planning to withdraw the troops that are officially there, but there's still the possibility they could end up extending their stay a little bit if the Taliban kind of overplays their hand and blowing people up in the next few months. And there's also the possibility that the US government could kind of play games with claiming they don't have troops when they actually do have some troops there. So, I mean, as I see it, one thing would be like they could, that I hope they'll do, and I don't know if they will or not, would be to do this mass evacuation. But whether or not they do that, they also may attempt to provide some support, some security support to Afghanistan to keep the government from collapsing. I think in terms of what people can do, contact the White House, but probably more importantly, contact Congress, because they are more apt to listen to people, and the executive branch is not really that responsive to individual people. I think if members of Congress are hearing a lot from constituents about we have moral obligations to Afghan interpreters, and there's also national security problems with abandoning our allies, then Congress could potentially put a lot of heat on the Biden administration to deal with this issue and not just pull out of there and leave 10,000 interpreters behind with no plan for how to get them out alive. So yeah, I hope that, I don't know what all the discussions are, and a lot of this is classified anyway, but one thing that is clear is that the Biden administration has been responsive to public pressure on other issues like the refugee cap. It only took them 4 hours to go from saying, oh, we're not going to raise the refugee cap to actually we are going to raise the refugee cap. So I think if there is enough like outpouring, enough of a public outcry about Afghan interpreters, it would definitely increase the possibility of them actually doing something drastic, like trying to do this mass evacuation. It also may increase the chances of them providing more like behind the scenes support to the Afghan government to try to avoid like the worst case scenario in a withdrawal.
Right. And you mentioned how during the Obama administration, it was conservative media that held them to account regarding their record on getting translators to U.S. soil. And speaking as one Republican to another, I will say that in the past few years, I think that Republicans have sort of been changing their tone on immigration, not just illegal immigration, but immigration in general. Senator Tom Cotton, introduced legislation at some point that would have, that if it had passed, it didn't pass, but had it passed, it would have cut the number of green cards issued by half every year. Other Republicans, have started calling for this. Michael Wood, the guy I interviewed who was running for Congress, and who we both like, because he's anti-Trump. He was also calling for this. This was also his stated position. So I guess, I just ask, like, how do we remind Republicans, why is it that immigration is good, and specifically, for those, why is it that immigration in general is good, but also specifically for those, who have sacrificed themselves for the United States military to give them vital information, and like, how do we remind them how important it is to allow people to come to U.S. soil, who especially those who are able to provide that critical information?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's unfortunate. I mean, as you do, that the Republican Party has kind of taken this turn on immigration that I think they used to kind of be more balanced and saying if you were against illegal immigration, we're in favor of legal immigration, and now it's kind of been against all immigration. Personally, for me, the most compelling reason to help our allies is the moral reason that it's simply wrong to take someone who's sacrificed their life and who's saved American lives and leave them behind to get killed by the same terrorists they helped us fight. And the problem with these countries is the alternative is not like live in a country with a lower standard of living versus live in the US. The alternative is getting tortured and murdered by terrorists. So that makes it a compelling case. I mean, a lot of these people would be happy to live in Afghanistan if they could live in Afghanistan, but they can't. Sooner or later, they're going to be hunted down and killed, and their families will be left destitute. So, I mean, for me, that's what motivates me, and that's what's kept me going for the last 4 years on trying to save this interpreter, is just that if we stop, we know that he and his whole family meet a horrible fate. I think, and as you touched on, there's also the national security aspect, and I think it's a serious problem for America and our Western allies if we can't get the help of these native-born people who know the language and who know the networks and who are able to provide intelligence. Our national security is really dependent on local partners, and if people know that we're going to use their services and then leave them behind, it's going to be harder to recruit interpreters. And we're already seeing that, like in Iraq, the US has started having trouble recruiting interpreters because there's too many, or they'll just say, well, I'm not going to go out on missions because I can't afford to have my face seen and have terrorists figure out who I am. So and not just in Afghanistan, but I mean, there's many countries that are trying to deal with terror networks, and where the US is trying to partner with locals to collect intelligence. So yeah, I think that there's the moral and the national security issue, and then I think there's also the cultural and economic ways that we benefit from having immigrants. I mean, including refugees. Refugees oftentimes have a little trouble. Some of them have trouble getting started economically at first. I mean, most of them are hardworking. Most of them are grateful to be in this country. Some of them are well educated, like this Mohammed I'm trying to help has a master's degree. But some refugees are not well educated. But I think, I mean, regardless, when they're here, it is inspiring to see, it's inspiring to hear their stories and the way that they've persevered through very difficult circumstances, and, you know, to see how grateful they are to be somewhere that they're safe. I think the other thing is that a lot of people do not have no clue how hard it is for interpreters to immigrate here. So I run into a lot of people that just assume that, like, oh, well, interpreters shouldn't need help. And I've even had veterans tell me that, well, if he was a good interpreter, his veterans would help him. But a lot of veterans have lost contact with their interpreters, and a lot of veterans, I mean, some of the people who would be veterans are dead, because, I mean, some of the Americans that went to Iraq and Afghanistan didn't make it. So, I mean, you could have an interpreter, and maybe the American who would have been advocating for him got blown up by an IED several years ago. So, and I've also tried to do, some veterans are still in the military and they're not really willing to get involved in advocating for an interpreter because because it may be an issue with the position they have. Others have a lot of PTSD, and it's really just pain, like emotionally, they're not able to deal with this. So it's frustrating that there's this assumption that any interpreter worth saving is going to have a veteran willing to move mountains to help him. And I think there are many veterans that are moving mountains to help their interpreters, but there are other interpreters that may have a veteran out there somewhere who would be willing to do that, who may not even be in contact with them for whatever reason. So some of these interpreters, through no fault of their own, have lost contact with the military or lost some of the documents they need to do an SAV or whatever. And a lot of people just have no clue how difficult it is for interpreters to ever get here, even when everything goes right. And when any little thing goes wrong, then they have no option. And like the Mohammed I'm trying to help, he is in hiding in Pakistan. He does not have a passport, and he cannot get a passport because there's been a multi-year embargo in Pakistan on the Afghan embassy giving out Afghan passports, because Pakistan likes to send their Taliban to Afghanistan to blow people up, and they also like to make it look like it's the Afghan Taliban. So Pakistan had been acquiring Afghan passports to send with their suicide bombers to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan got tired of this and said, very well, then we're not going to give out any Afghan passports to anybody in Pakistan. And now that's not supposed to be legal, but they've been doing it for 4 years and no one's doing anything to stop it. And I've had people, including at the Pentagon, say, oh, well, Mohammed should just do an SIV. It's like, well, he can't get a passport, which is a policy requirement. And also, and one of the defense companies he worked for is defunct. All the records have been deleted, so they don't even exist anymore. So all of these are circumstances outside of his control. And I have people that just want to say, oh, well, the problem is that he did the wrong visa type. I'm like, well, they were two different valid paths. And the problem is that our government has denied him and has provided no justification. His stonewalled Congress for 3 years when they asked why, and then went on to blacklist his toddler to try to justify the whole thing. So it's just, yeah, it's frustrating that the situation is so bad and that so few people understand that. And also, I think there's kind of the concept that, I think when the Syrian refugees thing got politicized about 4 years ago, because I think Hillary Clinton was like, the Obama administration had been criticized for not accepting more Syrian refugees in the middle of a Syrian refugee crisis. Hillary Clinton said, oh, well, if I get elected president, I'm going to have 200,000 Syrian refugees. And Trump was like, if I get elected president, I'm going to ban all Muslims. Then we sort of started to see this bifurcation. Instead of generally bipartisan support for the refugee program, we saw more and more Republicans are like, yeah, we don't need refugees anyway. And the Democrats have kind of doubled down on the let's have lots of refugees. But I think there's sort of stereotypical refugee is this Syrian Muslim with no connection to the US that wants to come to the US. What a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the refugees, like Iraqis and Afghans, that are coming, in some cases they're like persecuted Christians. Like a lot of the Iraqi refugees that have been resettled in the US are actually Christians and not Muslims. And especially of Muslim Iraqis and of Afghans, a lot of them are US military interpreters or family members of interpreters. So even though theoretically Afghan interpreters are coming through the SIV program, a lot of them are actually coming through the refugee program. No one's really talking about it or tracking it. But like I know of multiple individuals who are Afghan refugees who came like through the different program than they theoretically do. So I think that's another thing about the refugees is that a high percentage of them have some sort of US connection already, have served the US in some way, or their family member is. And we do already vet refugees a lot, and we're not usually just picking random Muslim refugees out of a refugee camp somewhere and saying, oh, here, come to the US. In most cases, these people there's either a religious persecution issue or there's a connection to the US issue that puts them in more danger than the average person from their country. And they have to demonstrate that to be even eligible for the program, is that they have some special circumstance, not just that they're born into a country that has a high crime rate and they kind of want to leave the country. And so yeah, I think there's been a lot of stereotypes and politicization of immigration, and then as a result, a lot of people are failing to appreciate these programs and even understanding who's really being helped by these programs.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you're in the process of trying to get Mohammed into Canada, and if there's anyone who's watching this who is from Canada, what can they do and what should they do? And then if they want to sponsor, what can they do and what should they do?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. So what we're trying to do is either, if we found an organization called the sponsorship agreement holder that had some availability, then that would be wonderful. What we've been more focused on, I mean, because oftentimes if a church or another group has an ability to sponsor refugees, they kind of already have picked their own refugees. So what we've been more focused on is trying to find 5 people to create a private group of 5 sponsorship. The minimum requirements is that someone has to be a Canadian resident with either citizenship or a green card, needs to not be on welfare and not have a criminal record. They do not need to demonstrate a certain income level. They just need to not be on public assistance. And then we will have to find 5 to 8 people somewhat in the same geographical location. So we have a couple people in Niagara Falls and a couple in Toronto that have already said they'd be willing to help with this, and we'd have to get a group of 5 to 8 people together and somewhat in the same area. And what the sponsors are agreeing to is really a time commitment and not a financial commitment, because we have separately gotten a US nonprofit to help process donations, and we are going to fundraise separately. And so the funds will be, it's about 40,000 Canadian dollars that's required for a family of this size that will have to be put into trust ahead of time. So we're working on getting donations for this and setting the money aside, and then the sponsors would be simply committing their time to say that we will take the responsibility to aid this family in getting an apartment, setting up an apartment, applying for jobs, enrolling in school, and things like that. So strictly a time commitment is not a financial commitment or financial liability. Of course, if anybody would like to donate financially, that would be great as well, but we are trying to separate the two so that we're not assuming that someone has like both time and money to contribute to this. So if anyone is willing to sponsor or consider sponsoring or has friends that might consider it, then they can contact me. My email is save.aysha, which is AYSHA @gmail.com, and I can put you in touch with the Canadians that are that are also willing to sponsor. We're working with someone from Northern Lights Canada, which is a nonprofit that's, I think, in the Niagara Falls area. At least the person that our contact there is in the Niagara Falls area. And we've written a case that goes into detail about like the family's danger that they're facing. And they are already UN approved refugees. So we're working on, we have all the paperwork mostly done. We just need to find the people that are willing to volunteer their time to help with this. And then they will also have to like put their name on, not as assuming financial liability, but as being willing to dedicate their time. And we do have a couple of GoFundMes, which is one way that people can donate. We also have a nonprofit that will be set up soon. Canada has recently come up with a new policy that they want to see a nonprofit involved in the fundraising process so that they can sort of verify that the donations like come from a legitimate source. And we do have a nonprofit that is going to be processing the donations. It's the Kurdish Alliance of North America, which I'm a part of. It promotes an alliance between Kurdish people and Americans, and others that sort of have a similar vision to fight terrorism in the Middle East. So this nonprofit has agreed to help process donations on behalf of Mohammed and family. But in the meantime, we are still using Gofundme to collect donations for the family. So if someone is willing and able to contribute financially, then we have a GoFundMe. We have one that was set up earmarked for Canada and one fund, and then one that's earmarked for the living expenses for the family. So the one that goes to the living expenses, it's titled Save Aisha and Her Family. So if you search GoFundMe for Save Aisha and Her Family, then you will see that fundraiser, so that if someone is able to contribute to that, we greatly appreciate that. My family and I have been financially supporting Mohammed and his family for several years because he's living in hiding. He can't even leave his house. And he gets charged more for everything, including rent and medical expenses, because he's undocumented in Pakistan. And he was robbed of his life savings by Pakistani police about 4 years ago. So we've been supporting them financially for like food and rent and medical expenses. And then we're also saving money to put into we have to set aside a year of living expenses in Canada before that case can be processed.
It's absolutely, insane what Mohammed's going through, and I really hope that we can get him stateside. And I want to make sure that I can do everything I can to help you make sure that happens. So again, if anyone who, in Canada who's watching, wants to help out, you know who to reach out to. And where can people follow you on Twitter, to know what you're up to?
My Twitter handle is at Kristy Perano, so KRISTYPERANO. And I tweet some about this specific case. I tweet some about various political things, but I tweet a lot about refugees and US military interpreters and stuff like that.
Kristy.
And actually how we connected, because Jonathan and I run in similar Twitter circles with sort of conservative-minded people who were able to see some character flaws in our former president.
Yep, for sure. Kristy Perano, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It was an honor to join you today.
Thank you. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that we get Mohammed safe. I really hope that we're able to do that.
I really appreciate it.